everyone. It's time for more Hobbit. Thank you all to my wonderful Patreon supporters. You can go to patreon.com/bowtiewhisperguy if you want to support me. But now, let's get back to the Hobbit. They had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in this part of the mountains, but their main gate used to come out on a different pass, one more easy to travel by, so that they often caught people benighted near the gates. Evidently people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened their new entrance at the top of the pass the dwarves had taken quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up until now. "I must see if I can't find a more or less decent giant to block it up again," said Gandalf, "or soon there'll be no getting over the mountains at all." As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell and he realized what had happened, in a flash which killed the goblins that were grabbing him, and he nipped inside the crack just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and the prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. "Very ticklish business it was," he said, "touch and go." But of course Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments of fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks, the old Tooks' Midsummer Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains, but it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them to the right direction. "They made that gate ages ago," he said, "partly for a way of escape if needed, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come out in the dark and do great damage. They guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubly after this," he said, laughing. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin, and a great many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might be said to have the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. "We must be getting on at once, now that we are a little rested," he said. "They will be out after us in the hundreds when the night comes on, and already the shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of moon if it keeps fine, and that is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by." "Oh, yes," he said, in answer to more questions from the Hobbit. "You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today is Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning when we were captured. We have gone miles and miles and come right down through the heart of the mountain, and now we are on the other side. Quite a shortcut, but we are not at the point to which pass would have brought us. We are too far north and have come awkward country ahead, and we are still pretty high up. Let's get on." "I'm so dreadfully hungry," groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit! His stomach felt all empty and loose, and his legs all wobbly now that the excitement was over. "Can't help it," said Gandalf, "unless you'd like to go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony and your luggage." "No, thank you," said Bilbo. "Very well, then. We must just tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be worse than having none ourselves." As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a little bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries he found on its bank. But that was not much good. They still went on, the rough paths disappearing, the bushes and the long grasses between the boulders, the patches of rabbit-cropped turf, and thyme and sage and marjoram and the yellow rock roses all vanished, and they found themselves at the top of a wide, steep slope of fallen stones, the remains of a landslide. They began to go down this rubbish, and small pebbles rolled away from their feet. Soon larger bits of split stone went clattering down, and started other pieces below slithering and rolling. Then lumps of rock were disturbed and bounded off, crashing down with a dust and a noise. Before long the whole slope above them and below them seemed to be on the move, and they were sliding away, huddling all together in fearful confusion of slipping, rattling, cracking slabs and stones. It was the trees at the bottoms that saved them. They slid into the edge of a climbing woods of pines that stood right up the mountain slope from the deeper, darker forest valley below. Some caught hold of the trunks and swung themselves into the lower branches. Some, like the little Hobbit, got behind a tree to shelter from the onslaught of the rocks. Soon the danger was over. The slide had stopped, and the last faint crashes could be heard as the largest of the disturbed stones went bounding and spinning among the bracken and the pine roots far below. "That has got us on a bit," said Gandalf, "and even goblins tracking us will have a job to come down here quietly." "I dare say," said Bomba, "but they won't find it difficult to send stones bouncing down on our heads." The dwarves and Bilbo were feeling far from happy, and they were rubbing their bruised and damaged legs and feet. "Nonsense! We are going to turn aside here out of the path of the slide. We must be quick. Look at the light." The sun had gone down behind the mountains. Already the shadows were deepening about them, though far away through the trees and over the black tops of those growing lower down, they could see the evening lights on the plains beyond. They limped along now as fast as they were able in the gentle slopes of the pine forest in a slanting path leading steadily southwards. At times they were pushing through a sea of bracken with a tall fronds rising right above the hobbit's head. At times they were marching along as quiet over a floor of pine needles, and all the while the forest gloom got heavier and the forest silence deeper. There were no wind and evening breeze, even the sea sighing of branches of the trees. "Must we go any further?" asked Bilbo. When it was so dark, they could only just see Thorin's beard wagging beside him, and so quiet that he could hear the dwarves breathing like a loud noise. "My toes are all bruised and bent, and my legs ache, and my stomach is wagging like an empty sack." "A bit further," said Gandalf. After what seemed like ages further, they came suddenly to an opening where no trees grew. The moon was up and shining into the clearing. Somehow it struck all of them as not at all a nice place, although there was nothing wrong to see. All of a sudden they heard a howl away down the hill, a long shuddering howl. It was answered by another, and a good deal nearer to them. Then by another not far away to the left. It was wolves howling to the moon, wolves gathering together. There were no wolves living near Mr. Baggins' hole at home, but he knew that noise. He had had it described to him often enough in tales. One of his elder cousins, on the Took side, who had been a great traveler, used to imitate it to frighten him. To hear it out in the forest under the moon was too much for Bilbo. Even magic rings are not much use against wolves, especially against the evil packs that lived under the shadow of goblin-infested mountains over the edge of the wild, on the borders of the unknown. Wolves of that sort smell keener than goblins, and they do not need to see you to catch you. "What shall we do? What shall we do?" he cried. "Escaping goblins to be caught by wolves?" he said. It came to that proverb, though he now thought of out of the frying pan into the fire in the same sort of uncomfortable situations. "Up the trees, quick!" cried Gandalf, and they ran to the trees at the edge of the glade, hunting for those that had branches fairly low, or were slender enough to swarm up. They found them as quick as they could, you can guess, and up they went as high as ever they could trust the branches. You would have laughed, from a safe distance, if you had seen the dwarfs sitting up in the trees with their beards dangling down like old gentlemen gone cracked and playing at being boys. Feely and Keely at the top of a tall larch, like an enormous Christmas tree. Dory, Nori, Ori, Owen, and Glowin were most uncomfortable in a huge pine with regular branches sticking out at intervals, like spokes of a wheel. Bifur, Bofer, Bomber, and Thorin were in another, Dwalin and Balin had swarmed up a small, tall, slender fir with few branches and were trying to find a place to sit in the greenery of the topmost boughs. Gandalf, who was a good deal taller than the others, had found a tree which they could not climb, a large pine standing at the very edge of the glade. He was quite hidden in its boughs, but you could see his eyes gleaming in the moon as he peered out. And Bilbo, he could not get into any tree, and he was scuttling about from trunk to trunk like a rabbit who had lost its hole and has a dog after it. "You've left the burglar behind again," said Nori to Dory, looking down. "I can't always be carrying burglars on my back," said Dory, "down tunnels and up trees. What do you think I am, a porter?" "He'll be eaten if we don't do something," said Thorin, and there were howls all around, getting nearer and nearer. "Dory," he called, for Dory had the lowest down and the easiest tree. "Be quick and give Mr. Baggins a hand up." Dory was really a decent fellow in spite of his grumbling. Poor Bilbo could not reach his hand even when he climbed down to the bottom branch and hung his arm down as far as he could. So Dory actually climbed out of the tree and let Bilbo scramble up and stand on his back. Just at that moment, the wolves trotted in, howling into the clearing. All of a sudden, there were hundreds of eyes looking at them. Still, Dory did not let Bilbo down. He waited till he had clambered off his shoulders into the branches, and only then he jumped for the branches himself, only just in time. A wolf snapped at his cloak as he swung up and nearly got him. In a minute there was a whole pack of them yelping all around the tree, leaping up at the trunk with eyes blazing and tongues hanging out. But even the wild wargs, for so the evil wolves over the edge of the wild were named, cannot climb trees. For a time they were safe. Luckily it was warm and not windy. Trees are not very comfortable to sit in for long at any time, but in cold and in the wind, with wolves all around you waiting below, they can be perfectly miserable places. This glade in the ring of trees was evidently a meeting place for the wolves. More kept coming in. They left guards at the foot of the tree in which Dory and Bilbo were, and went snuffling about till they had smelt out every tree that had anyone in it. These they guarded too, with all the rest, hundreds and hundreds it seemed, went and sat in a great circle in the glade, and in the middle of the circle was a great grey wolf. He spoke in a dreadful language of the wargs. Gandalf understood it. Bilbo did not, but it sounded terrible to him, as if they were all talk about cruel and wicked things, as it was. Every now and then all the wargs in the circle would answer their grey chief all together, and their dreadful clamour made almost the Hobbit fall out of the pine tree. I will tell you what Gandalf heard, although Bilbo did not understand it. The wargs and the goblins often helped one another in wicked deeds. Goblins do not usually venture very far from the mountains, unless they are driven out and are looking for new homes, or are marching to war, which I am glad to say was not happening for a long while. But in those days they sometimes used to go on raids, especially to get food or slaves to work for them. Then they often got the wargs to help them and shared the plunder with them. Sometimes they rode on the wolves like men do on horses. Now it seemed that a great goblin raid had been planned for that very night. The wargs had come to meet the goblins, and the goblins were late. The reason, no doubt, was the death of the great goblin and all the excitement caused by the dwarves and the Bilbo and the wizard for whom they were probably still hunting. In spite of the dangers of this far land, bold men had been of late making their way back into the south, cutting down trees and building themselves places to live in among the pleasant woods and the valleys among the river shores. There were many of them, and they were brave and well armed, and even the wargs dared not attack them if there were many together, or in the bright day. But now they had planned with the goblins to help come by night upon some of the villages nearest the mountains. If their plan had been carried out, there would have been none left the next day. All would have been killed, except for a few the goblins kept from the wolves and carried back as prisoners to their caves. This was dreadful talk to listen to, not only because the brave woodmen and their wives and children, but because of the danger which now threatened Gandalf and his friends. The wargs were angry and puzzled at finding them here in their meeting place. They thought they were friends of the woodmen, and had come to spy on them, and would take news of their plans into the valleys, and then the goblins and the wolves would have to fight a terrible battle, instead of capturing prisoners and devouring people awake suddenly from sleep. so the wargs had no intention of letting anyone go and escape from the trees, at any rate not until morning. And long before that, they said, the goblin soldiers would be coming down from the mountains, and goblins can climb trees or cut them down. Now you can understand why Gandalf, listening to this growling and yelping, began to be dreadfully afraid, wizard though he was, and to feel that if he was in a very bad place and had not yet escaped at all the same he was not going to let them have it their own way, though he could not do very much stuck up in a tall tree with wolves all around on the ground below. He gathered the huge pine cones from the branches of his tree, and then he set one alight with a bright blue fire, and threw it whizzing down among the circle of the wolves. It struck one on the back, and immediately his shaggy coat caught fire, and he was leaping to and fro, yelping horribly. And then another came, and another one in blue flames, one in red, one other in green. They burst on the ground in the middle of the circle, and went off in colored sparks and smoke. A specially large one hit the chief on the nose, and he leapt in the air 10 feet, and then rushed round and round the circle, biting and snapping even at the other wolves in his anger and fright. The dwarves and Bilbo cheered and shouted. The rage of the wolves was terrible to see, and the commotion they made filled all the forest. Wolves are afraid of fire at all times, but this was a most horrible and uncanny fire. If a spark got in their coats, it stuck and burned into them, and unless they rolled over very quick, they were soon all aflame. Very soon, all about the glade, wolves were rolling over and over to put out the sparks on their backs, while those who were burning and running about howling and setting others alight, till their own friends chased them away, and then fled down the slopes crying and yammering and looking for water. And if you want to find out what happens to Bilbo and the dwarves and Gandalf facing down the wolves and maybe goblins, we'll cover that next time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to talking to you soon.